I kind of had this startling discovery that dollar for dollar, largest human trafficking market in the world is the United States of America. I joined the United States Air Force, went straight into the special operations.
What does that mean? You jump out of something to go rescue?
You have to be willing to jump out of perfectly good airplanes. A lot of times it's real boring. You're just sitting around, and then it gets extremely exciting, and you kind of wish it was boring again. So let me get this straight. The most powerful military the world has ever seen isn't doing anything to protect their own children. I could try to do something about this problem. But from 2010 to 2015, they had an 846% increase in suspected child trafficking cases. The iPhone came out, and you had Facebook app, the first social media app to hit.
DeliverFund, what you guys do?
Seeing what was happening with trafficking, we work with over 7,000 law enforcement officers. We have built the largest counter-human trafficking database on the planet. Parents, you have to talk to your children about trafficking. We're commodities.
What can everyday people do to help combat human trafficking in their own communities?
How do people who work at the Central Intelligence Agency date?
Welcome back to Misunderstood with Rachel Yucatel. Today we're diving into a topic that is as urgent as it is overlooked: human trafficking. It's a crisis happening in plain sight, yet so many of us don't truly grasp the scale of it or how it even operates. Joining me is a man who has spent his career in the shadows hunting down some of the world's worst criminals. Nic McKinley is a former Air Force pararescueman and CIA operative turned humanitarian warrior. He's the founder and executive director of DeliverFund, a nonprofit that leverages cutting-edge intelligence and counterterrorism tactics to dismantle human trafficking networks in the United States. With firsthand experience in the fight against organized crime and human exploitation, Nic has seen the dark underbelly of this industry and knows exactly how traffickers operate, and more importantly, how to stop them. Today, we're going beyond the headlines to understand why this issue affects all of us, how traffickers target victims, and what can actually be done to combat it. This is a conversation you won't want to miss. Please welcome Nic McKinley. Hi, Nic. Thank you so much for joining me on Misunderstood. How are you?
Hey, Rachel, thanks for having me. I'm doing great. What about yourself?
I'm great. I'm very happy that you're here. I find you to be one of the most fascinating people that I've ever come across. So I'm really excited to hear your story and have other people hear your story. It's an important one to hear. So I basically want to start off, in my intro, I explain who you are, but you've had an absolutely incredible career from all the things that you've done. Can you get into that a little bit and explain how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, I like to say I'm kind of proof that God uses the foolish things of the world, that is actually true. I started, obviously, my childhood was very formative because I was actually an orphan, dropped off on the stairs of an orphanage in the early 1980s by my mother. Don't really know much of the story there because adoptions and being an orphan in the early 80s was kind of like WITSEC. They literally changed your birth certificate and everything, and obviously there's no digital records. But I like to think that it was, she was probably in a rough place. My father was not involved in the picture at all. I do know that. So it was probably an act of mercy on me. Worked out really well because I got adopted by an amazing family and got to grow up in Montana, which is a pretty amazing place to grow up. You don't realize it when you're growing up in small town Montana, how awesome it is. You want to get out of there and go see the world. And so that's what I did. I joined the United States Air Force, went straight into the special operations component within the United States Air Force called Air Force Pararescue. I did that for about a decade, just over, because I did a year in the reserves. And then after doing a couple of years in the kind of private equity space, I got recruited to the Central Intelligence Agency, and I was fortunate enough to be part of one of the units at the CIA that carries guns and anger. on behalf of the taxpayer. Most people at the CIA are essentially professional typists. They go talk to people, and then they spend hours and hours typing up the conversation that they had with those people. And they are the mission. I mean, that's the reason the CIA exists. But there's small groups of primarily men who have military special ops backgrounds who facilitate all of the different intelligence operations that happen in high threat environments like Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Pakistan and Yemen and places like that. And I got to be fortunate enough to be part of one of those units. So that's me kind of by way of background, and I think what led to me sitting here.
Wow. Okay, so wait, let's start with the first thing you mentioned, the pararescueman. What does that mean? You jump out of something to go rescue someone who's in
Yes.
need?
So Air Force Pararescue is the only DoD component that has the very specific mission of getting good people and things out of really bad places. So the World Rescue for highest altitude rescue was actually done by an Air Force pararescue team in Alaska. I'm sure you are familiar with like the lone survivor story of Marcus Luttrell. It was Air Force pararescuemen that went in and picked him up. So there on the battlefield, there are Air Force pararescuemen who are responsible for dealing with the problems when things go wrong. And so as a career field, if everything's going right, you're kind of bored. You don't really have
Right.
anything to do. When things go terribly wrong, you suddenly become the focus of the mission, and then all eyes are on you, and you get
Mm.
to go in and solve that problem. It's an incredibly rewarding career field. It's probably the least known of the special ops career fields. Most
Yeah.
people know Navy SEAL or Marine Force Recon or Army Special Forces. They know SEAL Team 6. They know Delta Force. Very few people realize that the Air Force has the pararescue and combat control teams, which are the special operations ground component within the United States Air Force that work with all of the other special operations components. So it was an incredible experience, and I'm fortunate to have had it.
I'm curious what the training is for that. So obviously you have to be good at flying out of things or whatever.
Yeah, you have to
And
you have to
then,
be willing to jump out of perfectly good airplanes.
right, exactly. And then, I mean, do you get dropped into missions where you have no idea where the person is or the thing you're looking for, and you have to go search and do all the ground mission stuff? Or this is like a rescue where you see what you're going to get and bring it back up like you see in the movies, like, they
All of
hoist it up.
all, yeah, all of the above.
Oh,
So the training is pretty intense. Statistically, it is the hardest training in the Department of Defense, because every pararescueman is a combat diver, is Halo qualified, so skydive qualified, right? Combat diver, so they're qualified on underwater insertion techniques. Every pararescueman is a special operations combat medic, so essentially a paramedic with a whole lot more skills than a civilian paramedic. Every pararescueman is mountain qualified. So the training pipeline is about 2 years long, and then you get to and that training pipeline statistically is extremely difficult. Not only because it has a very high physical standard, and it also has a very high academic standard. And
mm,
so a lot of the folks who make it through on the physical side then wash out on the academic side, and the
right.
folks who were very good on the academics wash out on the physical stuff. So you really have to have everything. And so the training is usually right around 2 years, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. And you then get your team. You've got about 6 months where you're on OJT, which is kind of like a probationary period where you're not really allowed to do anything. You just continue to get trained by your team and your team leaders before you're actually allowed to then go do your job.
Mm.
So from a attrition rate perspective, I think my class started. There's a pre-selection that you kind of go through, which is just a half a day long. And assuming you pass all of that, and that a lot of people didn't, we ended up with, I believe it was 336 people started my class. 8 of us graduated.
No way.
Yeah, so
Wow.
it's a pretty intense process, and to be quite frank, there's a lot of people who probably should have made it who for whatever reason just were unlucky and didn't. I can think of many people I went through selection with who were stronger, faster, and smarter than I could ever have hoped to be, and yet I made it and they didn't. So
Wow.
there's also a certain amount of luck that, I didn't break a leg. I didn't get catastrophically hurt. I got hurt, but I didn't get catastrophically hurt to the point I couldn't continue training. I managed to get through the training process. Well, when you get to a team and you realize that you got lucky to get to go through that selection process and that training process and to make it, but then so did everybody else that's on your team. So when you take
Yeah.
that many people who all go through those things and you put them together, you can actually accomplish some really, really phenomenal, borderline impossible missions.
I can imagine. Is there anything you can share with us about one that stands out, or can you not talk about this?
Yeah, so I did 27 real world missions when I was a pararescueman. Keep in mind, I came in '96, so pre September 11th, and even though the first time I saw combat was in 1999, there wasn't that much going on. So
Right.
I did 14 combat deployments in the Air Force, and only 27 real world missions. But the actual the only times that on a mission, I thought like, wow, I very well may die, was actually on some civilian rescues. So Air Force pararescuemen are the only special operations component that actually have a civilian mission as well. So in California, there's a Guard and Reserve unit right outside of San Francisco that does missions all through the Pacific, and we have units in New York, in Florida, and Kentucky that do missions all through the Atlantic, like civilian missions.
Hmm.
So when there's a operation that the Coast Guard can't quite handle, then they'll ask the Air Force to allow pararescuemen to do that mission. So they'll jump out of an airplane in the middle of the ocean at night in the North Atlantic, right? You find that those types of missions are a lot scarier than combat missions, because combat missions you can affect, right? Somebody's shooting at you, you shoot at them, problem solved, problem staying solved, move on to the next piece. If you're in the mountains, you can't control that environment. So I remember one mission where it was actually Fire and Rescue Magazine's mission of the year. It was in New Mexico, and there was a climber who was climbing up a cliff and got his arm stuck as this giant boulder had shifted and was squeezing his arm.
Oh,
And he couldn't get his arm out. His arm had been crushed under the rock, but not to the point where it had severed the arm, because there was little rocks underneath it that was kind of propping it up a little bit. So he was stuck on that cliff. The local rescue service couldn't really handle it. They asked my PJ team to go do it, and so I was the team leader and got up there, and we ended up working with a bunch of different entities to actually pull this boulder off this guy's arm. But while that was happening, it was exceeding the strength of the ropes, and when that happens, you start to see these little coils of smoke that actually start to come out of the knots that are in the ropes. It's a really bad sign. It means those things are about to break.
right.
Meanwhile, we have myself and this climber who just had his arm stuck, and he had compartment syndrome. So when we removed the boulder, all that acidotic blood went into his heart and his brain, shut him down. So we had IVs in him. Like, all of this is happening on a vertical cliff face as we're just kind of hanging. Meanwhile, this rock is getting ready to rip these ropes apart, and that's going to kill us real fast if we get underneath that. And so I just remember I had another pararescueman there as well, and we pushed this climber away from the cliff, and we didn't know if he was dying or not. We just knew we had to get out of there. We were going to get crushed. And we pushed him away from the cliff, and we literally ran down the cliff until we could get to kind of a safe spot right about the time that those ropes started to give way. And the rock luckily didn't tumble down the cliff. It actually just ended up just crushing a bunch of other rocks as it fell, and it fell
Yeah.
into a relatively safe place, luckily for us. But I remember thinking, like, wow, is there somebody shooting at us? Because it sounded like what it sounds like when you get shot at, and it was actually chunks of the rock were 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 being crushed on the side of the cliff and then accelerating like bullets through this canyon.
Right.
And so we had to just kind of sit there and hunker down and treat this guy while we were waiting for all of that commotion to stop. And those are the kinds of things that happen where, you go into something like that and you're like, oh, we're going to go do all these combat rescues. It's going to be amazing. But some of those civilian rescues, I mean, they're way more dangerous than the combat stuff.
Wow. Okay. So after you got out of that, you said you went into something with financial. What was that next thing?
Yeah, so I went into essentially risk due diligence and risk mitigation for private equity firms, working with firms like Goldman and Bear Stearns back in the day, and KKR, and these big investment firms who had some risk issues that they needed to deal with, and for non-disclosure agreement reasons, I can't get into what exactly I was doing, but that allowed me to kind of see behind the curtain of how the civilian world worked,
Okay.
and got to do some incredible work with them. But it wasn't really, I was still a little young. I still
But can I
really
ask,
wanted to.
was it stuff that like was still getting your adrenaline going, or were you like pushing papers
Sometimes,
behind the desk? Okay.
sometimes it got my adrenaline going a little more than I wanted. Most of the type of work that I've done in my life up until the last 10 years, a lot of times it's real boring. You're just sitting around, and then it gets extremely exciting, and you kind of wish it was boring again.
Got it. Yeah.
And so, yeah, so
But
I did that
handling
with.
risk for a company like that, I'm assuming if it's like a publicly traded company, you're dealing with making sure that that risk is handled before the shareholders can hear about it or something to that effect.
Wow, you have been around a little
Well, I
bit
used
to
to work at
understand
Bloomberg
that.
News,
Most people don't
so
get it.
no,
So
I get
yes, that's exactly the way it works. I like to call myself a stock price protection professional. But yes, that was
yeah,
most of it. It was things that the company was doing overseas that they didn't necessarily want regulators or anybody to find out about for competitive reasons, right? Nothing
sure.
illegal. But for competitive reasons, they didn't want somebody to know that they were doing, investments in an emerging market or something like
Right.
that.
Or
And
sometimes
and
reputational reasons, but yeah, whatever it is.
reputational reasons, competitive reasons, like all types of different reasons on why they were doing it. But when you are doing investment activities in emerging markets in, say, coastal African countries or the Middle East, things go wrong, and
Sure.
sometimes they go terribly wrong. Well, those companies have actually more resources financially than the government does, but they don't have aircraft carriers and F-16s and Delta Force and these different people that can go and solve those problems. And so they look to folks like myself to put together plans and put together the resource stack to be able to get their people back
Got it.
or to protect the investment, one of the two.
So now, was this an easy transition to get into the CIA? That came after that, right?
So yeah, that came after that. Then
But like, who gets
literally.
into the CIA? We all hear about like, I mean, I've heard that you're called the real Jack Ryan, all this stuff, but like, you can't just like apply to get into the CIA. I feel like that's all spies and
Actually, you
stuff.
can.
Oh, you can.
You can go to CIA.gov right now, go
Uh-huh.
to employment opportunities, and you can put in an application.
Can I
The
become a
chances of you
spy?
getting well, so a spy, you don't want to be a spy. A
Oh, what do
spy
I
is
want to be?
somebody a spy is somebody who has access to information who steals it illegally, right?
Oh,
So a Russian general with the plans to the new ship the Russians are building, and we recruit him to give us those plans. He's the spy.
oh,
We are either spy handlers, or in my case, right, which they call case officers, or in my case, it's operational facilitators, right? So we're guys who would go out and actually, get the little sensor in the right place, or
ooh,
go with somebody who is going to go do something extremely dangerous in, say, a place like Ramadi, Iraq, and they need to get across a city where things are blowing up, or you're getting into gunfights, right? Those types of things. And so that's really where we specialized. And while our job was to support case officers and the people who were doing the important work, I always say that the support missions are always the most fun, because we were the ones who got paid to essentially work out and shoot guns and drive fast. What more could you want?
Totally. Wait, were you ever jumping through windows and shooting behind you,
Shooting behind me, no.
Okay.
Jumping through windows, yes.
With the gun out and like zigzagging
more than one occasion, yes.
Amazing. Okay, this is so cool.
That said,
how could you want to leave a job like that?
Well, at a certain point, you just kind of realize that you're just a cog in a very large machine in a system that is rigged. And while the work that we did was extremely important, we saved countless, like incalculable American lives. And the bad guys, right, the terrorists of the world are actively trying to hurt us right now. And the reason that is not happening is because there are incredibly brave men and women in our intelligence community and in our armed forces who are taking the fight to them overseas so that we don't have to try to fight them over here. So that there's incredibly important work that's happening at this kind of tactical national security level. But then you start looking at the strategic stuff and things that are happening within different administrations. And for me, it was, I came face to face with child trafficking and wanted to do something about that. And that is not that's not a topic that the CIA or the Department of Defense focuses on. And so I just really wanted to do something else. I also was dating a woman that I wanted to marry. My unit had an 86% divorce rate on marriages. So I realized that if I wanted to get married, and I'd already been divorced, and so if I wanted to try that again, I'm not going to be the guy who's going to defeat those odds. And so I really needed to move on and go do something else.
Nice.
And as I was getting older, and I did.
Nice. Are you still married?
We are still married to
Amazing.
two
All right, so
children.
it worked. So it was worth it.
Yeah, it did.
Let's be real. Aging isn't always graceful. You might notice low energy, brain fog, stubborn weight gain, or even changes in your mood and libido. It's frustrating when you don't feel like yourself. But here's the thing, you don't have to accept it as just part of getting older. That's where Renew Youth comes in. For over 25 years, they've been helping people just like you reclaim their energy, vitality, and confidence through personalized hormone therapy and age-defying treatments. Whether it's testosterone or estrogen therapy, thyroid support, peptide therapy, or cutting-edge anti-aging solutions, Renew Youth tailors treatments to your body's specific needs. Unlike cookie-cutter treatments, Renew Youth offers doctor-supervised customized programs to fit your unique biology, comprehensive hormone testing to identify exactly what your body needs, proven science-backed therapies that go beyond just hormones, helping with brain health, metabolism, and even skin rejuvenation. A real team of experts guiding you every step of the way. No guesswork, no one-size-fits-all plans. If you're ready to feel like yourself again, stronger, sharper, and more energized, don't wait. Head to renewyouth.com/misunderstood. That's renewyouth.com/misunderstood. Don't forget to spell it with 2 S's. MISS understood. Mention my name for an exclusive offer, because aging is inevitable, but how you age, that's in your hands. If you're anything like me, you have a really hard time sleeping, and you've heard all the things, right? You have to have a cold room. You have to not use your phone for like at least an hour before bed. You have to just like kind of lay there and not watch TV, do all these things. All right, fine. We could do all those things, but I used to have to rely on sleeping pills to fall asleep. I just couldn't fall asleep at all. And getting to sleep was one thing, but staying asleep was a whole nother game. So I wanted to turn you guys on to something that I really believe in, because it's working for me. And if it's working for me, I really want you to try it. It's called Dreamies. It's by Holistic Goddess. So you feel like you get your little dose of candy right before bed. It's grape flavored. It has some sugar on top of it. It tastes like a grape. It tastes like a grape gummy bear. It's good. It's not bad at all. I kind of want more. That's how good it is. I take it an hour before I go to sleep. And I'm telling you, I cannot keep my eyes open. I can't get through my book fully. I want to watch my shows all the time on Netflix. I can't even get through them. If you go to holisticgoddess.com, they're giving you 15% off. If you use the code UNDERSTOOD, which is part of my show, enjoy your sleep tonight. Try it. Let me know how it goes for you. Dream Ease by Holistic Goddess. Sleep tight. Mwah.
Wait, I have one dumb question. Like in Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you know how they couldn't tell each other what they did? So like
Right.
if was part of the divorce rate issue because the husband said he worked in like air conditioning and cooling businesses and he was like a Jack Ryan, or like what was the divorce rate about, do you think?
The fact that you're never there. So part of it, so I was gone 10 months out of the year. My wife and I, when we were dating, over a 6 month period, I think she physically saw me for 4 days or 3 days, something like that. There were times where I would, I was under a cover. So I broke cover to her eventually, but for a long time, she thought that I was, doing other things that I was not doing. And so nobody ever thinks about that. Like, how do people who work at the Central Intelligence Agency date?
No,
Like, you
but
think about that.
that's what I'm, well, what did you tell her you did?
I was a medical infrastructure analyst for the State Department Office of Regional Affairs.
That's what
And
you told her?
I could bore you to death with talking about the different things that I was doing, to help with hospital construction and all that. But obviously, I was up to some other things. So yeah, as you do this type of work, you are trying to, move on with your life.
Right.
Despite being very unconventional and very abnormal people, most people at the CIA actually have this desire to have a relatively normal life. But you can't really do that. And covers are not like the movies, right? Anybody who is under a cover, you're very careful about who you put yourself around because people get to know you even a little bit and they can start to see through that cover.
Sure.
And so, that's what happened with my wife when we were dating. Uh, we went to a shooting range as a date, right? And I was like, okay,
Okay.
fine, we'll go to a shooting range. And obviously at this point, I was pretty handy with a firearm. And so
Did you
but she also
pretend to
knew
be
that,
really bad?
well, so she knew I was in the military before.
Oh,
And
right,
she
right,
knew I
right.
was special ops in the military. So she figured I'd be able to shoot. And so I started shooting. And then the kind of, I guess, male testosterone kicked in and I started shooting kind of off the side of the target a little bit. And she thought I was doing really poorly. And so I started shooting. And then she looked back over and saw that I had shot a perfect heart. By the way, guys, if you've got some gun skills, it turns out that's a pretty good move. And so I had shot this heart and she was like, oh, like this guy really knows what he's doing. And then
Right.
over the next few months, I was actually in North Africa, and there was a story for why I was there, and I didn't tell her the country I was in. We told her a different country, and so she's like following the story that is kind of real, but I'm not really associated
I
with
get
it because I'm in another North African country,
it. Right.
and then the rebels in that country started. Basically kind of restarted a war and I was supposed to be coming home and then I'd tell her, oh yeah, I can't come home now. And then, I had to make up a story for why I couldn't come home. And at a certain point, like again,
Right.
these
She starts to think
cover
you're lying to
stories,
her. Yeah.
yeah, these cover stories, which are lies, are start like any they start to kind of come apart. And then I got home from that trip and she was like, well, we need to have a talk, right? Because that female intuition really kicked in and then she didn't know if I was a drug dealer, if I was had another family somewhere, and so
Right.
finally I was
So
like,
when your
well,
answer was like, no, I'm in the CIA, was she like, okay, sure you are?
yeah, she's like, really? Well, she was born and raised in DC, so it's not the first time.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there's lots of people in the national security infrastructure and apparatus there, and most people at the CIA, again, you've got most of them are analysts or case officers, right? There's very few people who do the kind of action oriented stuff that everybody sees on the movies,
Yeah.
and so there's only 2 units that has to take a physical fitness test, as an example. Most people at the CIA couldn't pass a physical fitness test to save their life. And my unit was one of those. So she kind of thought like, okay, well, maybe there's something national security related. So it wasn't a huge shock to her. But of course, I thought, okay, well, there's the end of the relationship because she's going to say,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, her entire relationship is based on a lie, and obviously she's very logical and understood the circumstances. And I'd actually already told the agency that I was going to break cover and tell her that I was, where I worked, and they're okay with that. So yeah, so that's kind of how that ended up happening.
I love that story. That's like the best love story I've ever heard. All right. So was there a specific moment in, your career up to that point that made you realize that human trafficking was a bigger issue than you thought, that it's something that interests you? Like, how did you get into what you really focus your life on now?
So when you look at human trafficking issues and you actually understand what they are, if you're traveling overseas, especially throughout the Middle East and Africa, you see it all over the place.
Hmm.
I always just assumed there was a version of me that was doing something about that, right? There's versions of me that were fighting narcotics. There's versions of me that are fighting terrorism. There's got to be a version of me that's dealing with human trafficking and specifically the child trafficking issue. And and so I just kind of assumed somebody was doing something about the problem, and I didn't really, that's not my mission. I'm not going to focus on that. And then I was actually in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, and we came across uh, what I like to call smoking gun intel on a child trafficker who was moving Pakistani children across the Afpak border and selling them to whoever for whatever. We were aware of that in Afghanistan and some of what was going on in I don't remember the Afghan the Pashto word for it anymore, but essentially there's these little T-boys who are being used for exactly what you would think, and pretty disgusting stuff. And again, just always assumed that somebody was doing something about that. And when we ended up with this intel, and I was working with a JSOC counterpart, and we wrote it up to try to get it out of station, and we couldn't find anywhere to send it. And the way that Intel works, it's almost like the banking system. Like think about it, right? So if you want to wire money to somebody, there's a routing number, an account number, and that's what makes sure that the money gets to the right place.
Yeah.
Well, Intel is really, I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's really no different, right? There's codes that make sure that the right information gets to the right person so that they can then put it into the right reports and get it to the right policymakers. Because at the end of the day, it's the president of the United States and his or her designees are the customers for all of the work that you're doing.
Hmm.
So we write this up and realize there was no intelligence code for human trafficking. It was not a mandatory presidential reporting requirement, which is basically a fancy way of saying the things that we're supposed to be focused on. Uh, it just wasn't. And that
Hmm.
made me really curious. And the cool thing about working at the Central Intelligence Agency as a staff officer is you have the highest security clearance that you can get. Like it does not go any higher. You are read into most of the very large classified programs that are happening. Like you kind of very much understand how the system works, and if you pay attention, you can really start to see how all of the different gears move and work together. And I think if the taxpayers understood that, which is something I have a problem with the CIA being a little too secret in what it is that they do. If the taxpayers understood how well the system worked, I actually think they would be pretty proud of that portion of their government.
Hmm.
So I used that platform essentially that I was sitting in to be able to reach into other places in the government and figure out what's going on. And so the cool thing about the CIA is it's very hard for people under the CIA to reach up into the CIA. It's extremely easy when you're at the CIA to reach down into any other part of the government to get whatever it is that you need or find out whatever you need. And so over a period of weeks and then months, I was trying to figure out like where's the special unit that is dealing with child trafficking issues? Where's the, again, where are the me's, where are the case officers, where are the analysts who are focused on this issue? And ultimately found that there wasn't any.
Hmm.
And I'm a I'm a big nerd at heart, and so I started reading every book I could find. I talked to some professors that I'd had from undergrad. They then put me in touch with other people who were doing research around the human trafficking issue, and then that's when I kind of had this startling discovery that dollar for dollar, the largest human trafficking market in the world is the United States of America.
Right.
And that was kind of my halo moment to go, whoa. So let me get this straight. The most powerful military and intelligence and economic might the world has ever seen that can kill people with flying robots from 6,000 miles away isn't doing anything to protect their own children from being trafficked. And in my mind, trafficking was still an over there issue. So it's
Right.
like, oh, well,
That's what
this
I was
this
going to
must
ask you.
be,
Yeah.
yeah, this is happening over there. There's U.S. children being brought over there. No, when you look at the data, over 86% of the victims of DOJ human trafficking cases are U.S. citizens. Over
So,
80% of the
yeah.
traffickers are U.S. citizens, and 99.5% of the customers are U.S. citizens.
So is this considered like a business? Like, do these people get together and decide how they're going to do this, or is this an
Yep.
individual thing where there's like sickos?
So it's a combination thereof,
Mm.
but it is very much a business. Traffickers in the United States, and when we say traffickers, um, w- w- the word
Yeah,
that
what does
used
that
to be
mean?
used.
Because I think of like a pimp. I mean, I don't even
Yeah,
know
there
what
you
I would
go.
think.
There's no
Okay,
such thing as a pimp. A pimp is a human trafficker, full stop.
got it.
I've had plenty of people try to argue that with me, and anytime I have a man who tries to argue that with me, I know everything I need to know about that man and the kind of stuff that he's into. No, pimps are human traffickers, full stop.
Okay.
And any pimp or anybody who wants to argue that with me, send a time and place, and I'll be happy to debate it with you. Pimps
So,
are human
but
traffickers
does that
because under the
mean?
law, they're
Mhm.
anybody who is controlling another person through force, fraud, or coercion, or a minor, especially for commercial sex, is in violation of U.S. human trafficking law.
Right.
So that's not me saying that. That's what the actual law says.
Right. Okay. So I want to talk about that for one more second because I think people listening, whether it's because the topic is so uncomfortable for people to get into so they don't know the facts or whatever it is, but I feel like there's a huge misconception with what human child trafficking is because
Hmm.
most of us civilians are like, that would never happen in my community. That would never happen to
Oh,
my child. That it's like for people in low income areas that don't know any better, who are very vulnerable, but there's got to be a vulnerable moment for my child. She's on her phone all day long. And I know that there are people she's playing Roblox with that are not little kids. They're older men or women. I mean, I don't know I don't think the sex discriminates, right? So I find it fascinating that more people aren't more astute or want to hear more about the topic because they think not my kid.
right. And they were correct to think that pre-internet. The internet
Okay.
has changed everything. So the way that I'm 46 years old. I'm getting considerably older, it seems like by the minute. But I remember where my family would be driving to church and we would end up going through a tough a rough spot in town, and you would see what were thought to be prostitutes, which were most likely human trafficking victims, under the control of a trafficker, aka a pimp. But you would see these prostitutes walking the streets, and we would kind of, as little kids, we'd make fun of them, and we would think it was funny. But for the most part, people thought that these were women who were making a choice to go sell themselves for sex, and that's how they were choosing to make their living. And
Mhm.
that does happen, right? Even in this day and age, like prostitution is a very real thing. Prostitution and human trafficking are two completely different things.
I was going to ask you
Um,
that. Yeah. Okay. So they
yeah,
cannot be considered the same. If a woman is making the choice to do this, even
that
if
is
she
not
has
human
a,
trafficking.
but even if she has a pimp,
So if she
what's
has
that?
a pimp, that is going to be that is always going to end up in a trafficking scenario. We've never seen it not end up in a trafficking
But don't
scenario,
you
right?
think that they look at that pimp as like an agent that just gets them more work?
Well, so sometimes that's exactly how the pimp, how the trafficker will sell themselves. Again,
Got it.
they talk about themselves as entrepreneurs and all
Got it.
that. But even when you talk to even the high end escorts who had these different services, they would tell you that yeah, it started there, and then it always devolved into force where they were taking the major majority of the money. It always ended up there, and so. So when we talk about human trafficking, the way that we want to think about it, also, human trafficking is not a southern border issue. That's human smuggling, right? Human trafficking is when a person is being forced, defrauded, or coerced into performing labor or a service for somebody else's economic benefit.
Okay.
Slavery. One person does the work, somebody else gets the money.
Okay.
Slavery, right? So when we talk about human trafficking, and then especially child trafficking, people will say, oh, they'll use the term child prostitute. That's not real. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. Anybody under the age of 18 legally is not allowed to make the decision to sell themselves for sex. So all commercial sex, and I do mean all commercial sex with anybody under the age of 18 is rape. Full stop. That is what it is under the law.
And that's what they would be prosecuted for.
Yes, that or child trafficking, or any number of other charges. There's a litany of charges that prosecutors can use. So back to what you were saying, I thought this was something that happened in low income neighborhoods. Pre-internet, you're right. And pre-internet, the reason it happened in low income neighborhoods is because you had young girls primarily, even though this does happen to boys as well. And increasingly it's happening to preteen and teen boys. But it's before the internet, it was young girls who were under supervised because maybe dad wasn't in the picture and mom was working multiple jobs. And so, she's kind of on her own and she meets the creepy guy who knows how to target her and voila, she becomes a trafficking victim. That's the way it used to happen. Right. Well, with these, which are broadband connected microcomputers that are in everybody's pockets, right? These cell phones. What these cell phones have done is made it so that that creepy guy can access every young girl on the planet and every teenager and preteen on the planet, boys too. And what do we know about teenagers? They make really dumb decisions. That's why we don't allow them to drive when they're 13. We don't allow them to vote when they're 13. We don't allow them to really have autonomy because they make dumb decisions. Right. And so this phone has made it so that their dumb decisions can actually be used as weapons against them. And the statistic I like to point out to people actually comes from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is a phenomenal organization. And so keep in mind, this is only talking about under 18. This statistic doesn't include the 18, 19, 20-year-old college girl who gets trafficked. They found that from 2010 to 2015, they had an 846% increase in suspected child trafficking cases. Wow. And what happened between 2010 and 2015? Well, the iPhone came out. We had broadband. Broadband became more affordable, so more people had it. And you had Facebook app, the first social media app to hit. And what that did was it allowed the predator to not just access the prey that they could in their own community, they could suddenly access prey from everywhere. Now you add the anonymity on that the internet provides, and you have a 40-year-old male who's 3,000 miles away from a 13-year-old girl who just made a social media post about how she's mad at her mom for not letting her wear the mini skirt, not letting her wear some age inappropriate clothing. And that trafficker slides right into her DMs and starts telling her all the things that she wants to hear. And, oh, you're so pretty. Your mom's just jealous of you. She's trying to keep you from growing up.
And catches her at this vulnerable moment that we were talking about before. Yeah.
Yeah. So targets her at the very moment of vulnerability and then gets her to do sends her gifts. And today gets her to send a photo that she regrets. And then uses that to control her. And in a place in California, I had a trafficking case that we were working with law enforcement where the school was a school with a very recognizable name. It's a private high school.
Mhm.
The girl who was the trafficking victim has a very recognizable last name. The school was tens of thousands of dollars a year to attend. Very, very wealthy, recognizable family. And the girl was being trafficked after school. So she was leaving her parents' house. Her parents were pretty checked out. But she was leaving her house, going to this private school and going to school all day. And then her parents thought that she was in extracurricular activities or hanging out with friends after school, and she was being trafficked for a few hours after school. And then she was going back home. And her parents knew that something was wrong with her. They just thought it was angsty teenage years. But it turned out that she was trying to get extra money because poverty is relative. And when your friends all have the $2,000 shoes and you only have the $1,000 shoes, well, you think you're in poverty. So
Right.
she started getting on some websites to try to make some extra money that she thought she was essentially just going to be I guess a friend to some wealthy older gentleman, and that worked out for her a couple of
Companion or
times.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, until eventually one of the dates that she scheduled turned out to be a trafficker. And her entire life was irreparably harmed from that
And
moment
and
forward.
when you say that, the difference that I want people to really hear is like she was in on it, it seems like, for those first couple dates until she met the
Yeah.
trafficker, which I would assume that person had some hold over her, that she was either too
Yes.
embarrassed to tell her parents about, and she had to continue this process of being in this. And you're making it seem like she could come home every day. So obviously he didn't kidnap her. But, it was like she continued to do it because of being probably embarrassed by whatever she was giving. And he was
Right.
threatening her that he was going to tell everybody.
And he got her addicted to drugs, so she didn't
Oh,
know
God.
how
Yeah.
to right, she didn't know how to get drugs. She didn't know how to administer those drugs to herself. Got her hooked on heroin specifically. And so what the it appears to be a teenager who's making some really bad decisions. In
Yeah.
reality, it was a teenager who made a few bad decisions, which is all teenagers
Yeah.
eventually, made a few bad decisions that then that the last bad decision ended up basically changing her life. And so
Right.
that's like you mentioned, Roblox. There's a report that just came out about Roblox and how it is a absolute cesspool. We'll get you a link for your show notes. And the amount of child exploitation and trafficking that is happening on Roblox. And the way that parents need to think about this is a predator is going to go to where the prey is.
Hmm.
So if you have anything that is designed for children, it is like Roblox. It is going to be a magnet for predators who want to prey upon children.
Hmm.
It's that simple.
Right. So,
And
go ahead.
so when you look at some of these things that happen within, especially within your larger cities, and you've got these young girls, they do this thing called sugaring, which is essentially where they go hang out with an older guy, and they're getting stuff in return for that. That very quickly turns into a trafficking situation. So it might start as somebody, again, just making really bad decisions. But the problem with the internet and the problem with smartphones is that everybody's got a camera. And so in the
Right.
case of this young girl from this private school, we'll spare you the details. You can use your imagination, but they had, should we just say, abused her considerably and videoed the whole thing. And that was the chain that they were using. And then they would give her narcotics as well. So now, not only does she have a psychological chain, but she now also has an addiction chain. And anybody who understands psychological captivity understands that that is way worse than actual physical captivity.
Mm, right.
And those chains are harder to break. Any
Right.
battered
Right.
woman in the world understands that.
One common myth about human trafficking is that it primarily involves kidnapping by strangers or like shadowy
Mhm.
organizations. But like a lot of what you're saying, these can be older kids in their same private school or
That's right.
whoever. I mean, it could be someone in their family, it could be somebody that they know or their parents know. And I want you to talk about that for a little bit because I think that, about what some of these big misconceptions are and for people to really look out for and know so that they're not, thinking this isn't going to happen to them or their child?
In the major majority of dog or of human trafficking cases, it's actually the trafficking victim who participates in their own abduction. It's somebody that they know. Now, it might be somebody they met online who then sends them a plane ticket to go from LA to New York. We had a case in New Mexico. I can remember the girl's real name. What's her? I can't remember the fake name that we gave her. I'm not going to obviously use her real name,
Yeah.
but the girl was dating somebody from her high school. She was working at a fast food restaurant, but it turned out the boy that she was dating at her high school was actually a recruiter for a trafficker, and so he dated her. You know, tried to love bomb her and get her to fall in love with him. And then one day said, "Hey, I can't pick you up from work. I'm sending my friend. And he said it was like his aunt or somebody like that, to come pick you up. And so picks her up in a nice car, it's a, convertible BMW. Yeah, we're gonna take you. I'll take you home. Oh, we just need to stop by my house real quick. And so she doesn't think anything of it. And what she didn't know was that the boy that she had been dating was a recruiter for a trafficker. She wasn't the only girl that he was obviously dating and recruiting. He had multiple girls that he was running, trying to bring to the trafficker.
Right.
The trafficker would pay him to do this. The woman whose car that he got in, that was essentially the trafficker's business manager. She took him to the trafficker's house where the trafficker and her brother engaged in a process that they refer to as seasoning. I'm going to leave the details out. Horrific stuff. And then she spent the next 3 months living in a dog crate. And they would take her out of the dog crate and sell her and put her back in the dog crate. And there was multiple girls in essentially a dog kennel, in these little individual dog crates. And one of the girls tried to escape, and so the trafficker killed her in a park, and then made all of the other girls watch, and put them back in the dog crates. And then one day, this is a young teenage girl, and she just decided that she'd rather die than live like that, and so she was gonna make a break for it, and she luckily got away, flagged down a police officer. Police did a phenomenal job. We got involved in the case, helped them figure out who the trafficker was, and he is currently serving 3 life sentences behind bars.
Wow.
So that's the that's the work that we do, but that's a great example of this was somebody who was in her school, and her friends all knew something was wrong with this guy. Her parents knew something was wrong with this guy, but friends and parents have been trying to tell teenage girls that certain dudes are no good for millennia, and it never really worked.
Right. You wouldn't assume the scale of that problem. Despite the scale of the problem, trafficking convictions seem to be relatively low. You don't hear as much about that. Am I correct on that?
Yes. So there's a couple of reasons for it. One, a lot of trafficking cases, we can actually pin the trafficker on money laundering instead of trafficking. And a trafficking carries a minimum mandatory sentence of 15 years. A money laundering charge will get you 30 years.
I see.
So the system is really backwards, which is like, there's states like Montana and Florida and Texas. I believe some jurisdictions in California and Arizona as well, where you'll get a life sentence for trafficking of a minor, right? For child trafficking. Unfortunately, that's not at the federal level. We really need to change that. As politicians who are listening to this, like let's get that law changed. But a lot of times prosecutors will go for the charge that's going to get the heavier penalty, and almost every human trafficker can be hit with money laundering or wire fraud or one of those types of cases. And so oftentimes they'll go for that charge instead of, especially if it's a federal charge, and instead of a human trafficking or a child trafficking charge.
Right. I want to talk about DeliverFund. Can you explain exactly what you guys do?
Yeah, so in response to all of the experience that I'd had with, seeing what was happening with trafficking when I was at the CIA, I kind of got that the road, or the road in the woods that diverged, right? And I had a choice. I could continue to go do the terrorism stuff, or just go into business and try to make a whole bunch of money, or I could try to do something about this problem. And I decided that I had the skills, I had the networks, I didn't have the funds, but I I had a general thesis that we could use the same types of methodologies that we use to fight terrorism, that we could use those methodologies to fight trafficking. And the reason why is because, and I hate to sound crass here and unempathetic, but let's keep in mind tiers do nothing for victims of human trafficking. Cold calculating strategy does. And so if terrorism is actually an illicit commodity market, we understand how to fight that. Well, these poor girls who are being sold were commodities.
Yeah.
That are being sold on a market. So if we could take the same things that we've learned from the war on terror, and one of the good things about the war on terror is that it lasted decades and we got really, really good at it, and we knew what works and what didn't. So if we could take those same methodologies and apply them to the trafficking fight, then we would probably win. And so that was the thesis for launching DeliverFund back in 2014. We just crossed our 10-year anniversary in October, and we've been doing it ever since. And we have had levels of success at helping law enforcement, prosecutors, and private companies fight human trafficking well beyond what we ever thought was possible. To today, not only do we work with over 7,000 law enforcement officers across the United States and any of the 18,000 jurisdictions that have access to our data, the data is really important, and we have built the largest counter-human trafficking database on the planet. And when I say largest, for the nerds like me that are listening, we're pulling in over 65 million data points a month on this issue, primarily here in the United States, a little bit in Europe as well, but primarily here in the United States. Like, that's the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
So we're
And
empowering.
I just wanted to go ahead.
We're empowering law enforcement to actually be able to do something about that by giving them direct access to the data. We then train them how to target these traffickers, and then we actually embed analysts within these human trafficking task forces. So we have, as an example, in Dallas, Texas, there's a full-time human trafficking analyst that is working with Dallas Police Department and the general or law enforcement in the general area. That is actually one of DeliverFund's employees whose salary and benefits and time are paid for by the generosity of donors in the Dallas area. And we're the same thing for Houston, and we're getting ready to do the same thing in a rural county in Montana, and over in Omaha, and actually in just south of LA as well.
Got it. So in doing some research on this, I just thought this was staggering. According to the International Labor Organization, correct me if I'm wrong with my numbers here, but this is what I found. Over 27 million people are victims of human trafficking globally, generating around 150 billion annually. That's crazy.
Right. Correct. And a lot of that, when you talk about that 27 million, people will say, like, oh, there's more slaves today than any point in history. That's just not true. But a lot of these statistics are so big that they include things that are cultural in other countries, right? So like child marriage, we consider that trafficking in the United States. In Afghanistan, they don't consider that trafficking. They consider that a Tuesday. Some of what we would consider slave labor in other countries, under our laws, culturally, they don't consider that slave labor. So when we focus on the United States of America, while our law enforcement has problems, we still have the best law enforcement in the world. We have the least corrupt law enforcement system and judicial system in the world. Not to say it doesn't have problems, but it is still the best in the world. And so when we look at what drives that, like the number that you gave, the economic number, you didn't give it in francs, you didn't give it in euros, you gave it in dollars. It's the US dollar that drives the global human trafficking market. So why would we spend an inordinate amount of money to go to Cambodia or Thailand or Vietnam or the Middle East to fight human trafficking, Eastern Europe, when we can do it right here, better, faster, and cheaper, and in a way that is infinitely scalable.
Right. Movies and media often dramatize trafficking in ways that tend to completely misinform people.
Yes.
What is one thing you wish that people, knew was real versus completely misunderstood?
That is a great question. I do a lot of podcasts and I've never gotten asked that question. And that might be something that I just start asking hosts to ask. I would say I would answer that two ways. The first would be what I wish they would understand is that the movie Taken is a complete fiction. Enjoy it for what it is. It's a good Hollywood movie, good action guy movie. Liam Neeson is a great guy with a particular set of skills. Awesome. Enjoy it as the entertainment it is, and don't think that has anything to do with reality. Right. There was a movie that came out called Sound of Freedom, complete fiction. Enjoy it for the entertainment that it is. Sure, it might be raising a little bit of awareness of what's happening with trafficking in places like Colombia, but that doesn't really apply to the United States of America. Mm-hmm. And then understand, parents, and I'm a parent, so I get this, especially parents of daughters. This phone is the most dangerous thing in your house. And you would be better off to take all the locks off your doors than you would to give your child unrestricted access to this phone. Because this phone will create irreparable harm in your child's life in ways that you won't even know about or understand. And there are no apps. There are great communications companies out there like Bark. I'm a big fan of the stuff that they're doing. Every parent should be using their tools, but those tools are not a replacement for good parenting.
Right.
Fathers, the absolute best thing you can do to keep your children from being vulnerable to being trafficked is to be a good father. Not to go get really good locks and go watch Taken and go take Krav Maga and jujitsu and buy a bunch of guns. Like, none of that matters. Go be a good dad and show your daughter what she's worth. That right there alleviates most of the human trafficking issue. And when we look at the victims of human trafficking, who are they? They're across all socioeconomic demographics. I know daughters of some of the wealthiest people in America who have been trafficked. I know some of the poorest people in America whose daughters have been trafficked, and everywhere in between. It increasingly is hitting the upper middle class and wealthy. And so understanding that is I think the first step in helping people to understand where the trafficking has come from. It's not the white van with free candy painted on the side of it, right? This is not the 1980s. Trafficking is coming through social media, and it's coming through gaming apps. And the phone and the different controlling apps do not have the ability to properly alert you to that. So you have to be a good parent, and you cannot just use the phone as a babysitter because it will eventually catch up.
Right. That gave me chills completely. Last question. For listeners who are moved by your story and the statistics we've discussed, what can everyday people do to help combat human trafficking in their own communities?
Great question. So we're actually recording this on Giving Tuesday. The work that we do at DeliverFund, which is one of my jobs. I've got a couple other companies as well, but the work that we do at DeliverFund is paid for not by the government. It is paid for by the generosity of donors. So if you want to see this type of capability continue to build, and you want there to be people like us that are going after the bad guys, we need your help. We can't, like, you're a podcast host. You're helping us get this word out. That's extremely important. So whatever your platform is, whatever your financial capability, doesn't matter if you've just got $5 and that means you're giving up a Starbucks for the day, or you've got a donor advised fund or a family foundation. Everybody can get involved. The second thing is, if you go to our website at deliverfund.org, you'll actually see that there's some training in what is human trafficking. So we have a human trafficking 101 course. Go get trained. At the end of that course, you'll actually get a certificate that works for employment compliance in all 50 states. You actually get something out of it, but then you can actually know what human trafficking is for real. And then the third thing is, if you're parents, you have to talk to your children about trafficking, just like you talk to them about drugs or alcohol or bullying or social media or mental health issues. Trafficking has to be something that you talk to your children about. And I'm going to add one fourth thing, which is if your child, one, build a trusting relationship with your child so that your child feels like they can come to you if they make a mistake and they send that photo that they regret on social media or to the person who's trying to extort them or whatever. Tell them that they can come to you. They are not going to get into trouble, and you are going to help them deal with that situation. And here's how you deal with that situation. One, the very first thing that you do is send that photo to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They will hash that photo. So basically, they'll do the math on the photo and give it a fingerprint, and then they will send that to the social media companies whose algorithms then will tear that photo out if somebody tries to repost it. So that's how you kind of manage the spread. Okay. And then the second thing that you do, besides don't touch the phone. Make sure you take screenshots and you preserve everything for law enforcement, is that when you call law enforcement, you call everybody. You call your county sheriff, you call the FBI IC3 office, you call the FBI ICAC office, you call everybody you can, and you be the squeaky wheel. And if you don't feel like you're getting the response from law enforcement that you should get, then you get your politician friends involved, you get your wealthy friends involved, you schedule a meeting with the mayor. We as a political constituency have to start holding our politicians accountable for properly funding our law enforcement to be able to deal with these types of issues. And the only way that they're going to know that this issue needs funding is if it does happen to your child, you are the squeaky wheel and you go out there and you make sure that people are paying attention to your problem.
Amazing answer. I could talk to you all day. You are fascinating. You gave us so much good information. Where can people hear more about you, and repeat your website again so they can get more information on DeliverFund?
Yes. So the organization is Deliver, DELIVER, Fund, FUND, and you can just go to deliverfund.org. And all the resources that we talked about are there. And for me personally, my website is Nic McKinley. That's NICMcKinley.com. I could be contacted through the email at the bottom of the website. I'm on Instagram at the.nic.mckinley and all of the other social media platforms as well.
Amazing, Nic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to Misunderstood. I'm your host, Rachel Yucatel. Please be sure to subscribe to the show and give us a 5-star rating and review. You can support the show by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/misunderstood with Rachel Yucatel. Do you have ideas for the show or want to reach out? Email us at info misunderstoodpodcast@gmail.com. That's spelled MISS understood. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.